Reineck, who successfully traced the relics of the totemic system in the cult and customs of later periods, though attaching from the very beginning only slight value to the factor of descent from the totem animal, once made the casual remark that totemism seemed to him to be nothing but une hypertrophie de l'instinct social. The same interpretation seems to permeate the new work of E. Durkheim, Les formes élémentaires de la vie religieuse, Le système totémique en Australie, 1912. The totem is the visible representative of the social religion of these races. It embodies the community which is the real object of veneration. Other authors have sought a more intimate reason for the share which social impulses have played in the formation of totemic institutions. Thus A. C. Haddon has assumed that every primitive tribe originally lived on a particular plant or animal species, and perhaps also traded with this food and exchanged it with other tribes. It then was inevitable that a tribe should become known to other tribes by the name of the animal which played such weighty role with it. At the same time this tribe would develop a special familiarity with this animal and a kind of interest for it which, however, was based upon the psychic motive of man's most elementary and pressing need, namely hunger. The objections against this most rational of all the totem theories are that such a state of the food supply is never found among primitive men and probably never existed. Savages are the more omnivorous the lower they stand in the social scale. Besides, it is incomprehensible how such an exclusive diet could have developed an almost religious relation to the totem, culminating in an absolute abstention from the preferred food. The first of the three theories about the origin of totemism which Frazer stated was a psychological one. We shall report it elsewhere. Frazer's second theory, which we will discuss here, originated under the influence of an important publication by two investigators of the inhabitants of Central Australia. Spencer and Gillen describe a series of peculiar institutions, customs, and opinions of a group of tribes, the so-called Arunta nation, and Frazer subscribes to their opinion that these peculiarities are to be looked upon as characteristics of a primary state and that they can explain the first and real meaning of totemism. In the Arunta tribe itself, a part of the Arunta nation, these peculiarities are as follows. 1. They have the division into totem clans, but the totem is not hereditary but is individually determined, as will be shown later. 2. The totem clans are not exogamous, and the marriage restrictions are brought about by a highly developed division into marriage classes which have nothing to do with the totems. 3. The function of the totem clan consists of carrying out a ceremony which in a subtle magic manner brings about an increase of the edible totem. This ceremony is called Intichiuma. 4. The Aruntas have a peculiar theory about conception and rebirth. They assume that the spirits of the dead who belonged to their totem wait for their rebirth in definite localities and penetrate into the bodies of the women who pass such a spot. When a child is born, the mother states at which spirit abode she thinks she conceived her child. This determines the totem of the child. It is further assumed that the spirits of the dead as well as of the reborn are bound to peculiar stone amulets called churinga, which are found in these places. Two factors seem to have induced Frazer to believe that the oldest form of totemism had been found in the institution of the Aruntas. In the first place, the existence of certain myths which assert that the ancestors of the Aruntas always lived on their totem animal and that they married no other women except those of their own totem. Secondly, the apparent disregard of the sexual act in their theory of conception. People who had not yet realized that conception was the result of the sexual act might well be considered the most backward and primitive people living today. Frazer, in having recourse to the Intichiuma ceremony to explain totemism, suddenly saw the totemic system in a totally different light as a thoroughly practical organization for accomplishing the most natural needs of man. Compare Haddon above. The system was simply an extraordinary piece of cooperative magic. Primitive men formed what might be called a magic production and consumption club. Each totem clan undertook to see to the cleanliness of a certain article of food. If it were a question of inedible totems, like harmful animals, rain, wind, or similar objects, it was the duty of the totem clan to dominate this part of nature and to ward off its injuriousness. The efforts of each clan were for the good of all the others. As the clan could not eat its totem, or could eat only a very little of it, it furnished this valuable product for the rest, and was in turn furnished with what these had to take care of as their social totem duty. In the light of this interpretation furnished by the Intichiuma ceremony, it appeared to Frazer as if the prohibition against eating the totem had misled observers to neglect the more important side of the relation, namely, the commandment to supply as much as possible of the edible totem for the needs of others. Frazer accepted the tradition of the Aruntas that each totem clan had originally lived on its totem without any restriction. It then became difficult to understand the evolution that followed, through which savages were satisfied to ensure the totem for others while they themselves abstained from eating it. He then assumed that this restriction was by no means the result of a kind of religious respect, but came about through the observation that no animal devoured its own kind, so that this break in the identification with the totem was injurious to the power which savages sought to acquire over the totem, or else it resulted from the endeavor to make the being favorably disposed by sparing it. Frazer did not conceal the difficulties of this explanation from himself, nor did he dare to indicate in what way the habit of marrying within the totem, which the myths of the Aruntas proclaimed, was converted into exogamy. Frazer's theory, based on the Intichiuma, stands and falls with the recognition of the primitive nature of the Arunta institutions, but it seems impossible to hold to this in the fact of the objections advanced by Durkheim and Lang. The Aruntas seem, on the contrary, to be the most developed of the Australian tribes, and to represent rather a dissolution stage of totemism than its beginning. The myths that made such an impression on Frazer, because they emphasize, in contrast to prevailing institutions of today, that the Aruntas are free to eat the totem and to marry within it, easily explain themselves to us as wish fantasies which are projected into the past, like the myths of the Golden Age. Gamma, the psychological theories. Frazer's first psychological theories, formed before his acquaintance with the observations of Spencer and Gillen, were based upon the belief in an outward soul. The totem was meant to represent a safe place of refuge where the soul is deposited in order to avoid the dangers which threaten it. After primitive man had housed his soul in his totem, he himself became invulnerable, and he naturally took care himself not to harm the bearer of his soul. But as he did not know which individual of the species in question was the bearer of his soul, he was concerned in sparing the whole species. Frazer himself later gave up this derivation of totemism from the belief in souls. When he became acquainted with the observations of Spencer and Gillen, he set up the other social theory which has just been stated, but he himself then saw that the motive from which he had derived totemism was altogether too rational, and that he had assumed a social organization for it which was altogether too complicated to be called primitive. The magic cooperative companies now appeared to him rather as the fruit than as the germ of totemism. He sought a simpler factor for the derivation of totemism in the shape of a primitive superstition behind these forms. He then found this original factor in the remarkable conception theory of the Aruntas. As already stated, the Aruntas established no connection between conception and the sexual act. If a woman feels herself to be a mother